Hello everybody, welcome to Behind the Numbers Around the World, an eMarketer podcast brought to you by Vtex. It's Monday, June the 28th, and I'm your host, UK Principal Analyst Bill Fisher, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you all to Around the World with Retail E-Commerce Trends. Welcome everybody to a Behind the Numbers show that takes you around the world, looking at what other countries are doing in the worlds of commerce, media and advertising. Every month, we take a topic and ask a couple of our international experts to fill us in on what's happening in their markets. This week, we'll be looking at some of the distinctive ways that D2C brands have been able to outmaneuver their competition, how Shopify has helped social commerce get a foothold.
And it's really the biggest barrier to social commerce's explosion, I think, is that payment facility within the social media apps themselves, and Shop Pay is providing an ability to do that.
And we'll also be looking at some of the environmental impacts of the e-commerce boom.
So Chinese government has pledged to be carbon neutral by 2060. So with the explosion of online commerce, it just runs counter to the goal of becoming carbon neutral. So I suspect that in the coming years, perhaps there will be more and more regulation being introduced.
In the first half of today's show, I'll be speaking with our Canada expert Paul Briggs about some of the stories coming out of his market. Then in the second half of the show, I'll speak with Chung, who will furnish us with some China-specific e-commerce insights. Before that though, we are making our own news this month. Our latest retail and e-commerce sales forecasts are hot off the presses. There's a report set coming out next week, in fact, and there's plenty to discuss. So I just want to give you a few of the top level trends that came out of those forecasts. Before the pandemic, we had forecast that total retail sales worldwide would rise by 4.5 percentage points in 2020 to $26.5 trillion. We now expect that total to be $23.5 trillion, a decline year on year of 2.8%. However, retail e-commerce boomed around the world. A 26% surge last year saw total retail e-commerce sales amount to over $4 trillion. And you know what? Things aren't going to let up this year either. We're going to see a further 17% growth in 2021. We'd expected strong growth, but nothing quite like this. And the result is that this year, e-commerce will account for nearly 20% of all retail sales worldwide. Remarkable. So that's the global picture. If we drill down into a few market specifics, the biggest market for e-commerce sales, surprise, surprise, it's China. This year, China will account for a staggering 52% of total e-commerce sales worldwide, about $2.5 trillion. And get this, next year, more than 50% of retail sales in China will be e-commerce sales. So that balance of physical digital is tipped to digital, staggering. And things aren't too shabby on that front in the UK as well, with that proportion for digital coming in at nearly 40% this year. In terms of e-commerce growth, as we've seen, 2020 was quite the year. Argentina led the way with a phenomenal 100% growth, if you can believe that, but Canada wasn't far behind with a 75% rise in 2020. This year, things are going to return to some semblance of normality, but one thing that has changed permanently has been this shift to digital, and that is not going to fall away. Okay, so let's meet my first guest today. As I mentioned at the top of the show, he's the person you need to speak to if you want to know what's happening in Canada. He's our principal analyst for Canada. He is Paul Briggs. Hi, Paul.
Hi, Bill. It's great to join this podcast.
Great to have you. Now, Paul, on each episode of Around the World, a new thing I'm doing, I'm introducing people to a relatable Britishism.
Okay.
Those words or phrases which Brits will understand, but elsewhere,
Got it.
Maybe not. Okay. So this month, I want to introduce you and all our listeners to the phrase big shop. Now, this actually came up in a real-world conversation I had with one of our researchers. We both know her very well, Angela Kim, brilliant researcher, not from the UK. She's based in our New York office or virtual New York office. She was reviewing a piece of UK research from Opinium. It was from their retail tracker, I think. And Angela reached out for a bit of advice because she didn't recognise this phrasing, big shop. which was being used in some of the survey questions. Any ideas?
Well, it's not a term that I'm familiar with, but I'm curious to know how it applies to the UK market.
Great. My plan is working perfectly. Well, it does not refer to a store's physical size.
Okay, I was thinking it could be like a big box, sort of a paraphrasing of big box stores. But,
Makes sense. Makes sense. But actually, it refers to the large weekly grocery shop that you usually drive out of town to do each week.
Right. Okay. So, now I get it.
Yeah, it's the main shop. So the research also referenced top-up shops, for example. So they're the local visits to the grocers for milk, bread, perishables, those types of things. So anyway, there you have it. The next time you refer to the weekly grocery shop, I challenge everyone listening to use the phrase, "I'm just doing the big shop." Anyway, enough of this nonsense. Let's get on to Canada. And sure. you have a few stories for us today, Paul, but I want to start with the general market in Canada. I mentioned in my intro there that Canada saw some phenomenal growth in e-commerce sales last year. Can you talk us through some of the reasons for that?
Certainly, yeah. So as you mentioned earlier, 75% growth in retail e-commerce in 2020 over 2019. So a couple of factors. Obviously, the pandemic is the main factor, and the degree of retail restrictions especially in Toronto, the country's biggest city, had a big impact on the ability of brick and mortar retailers to perform well with numbers, and forced the e-commerce channel to become a larger part of their revenue. So as an example, Toronto, a lot of those shops were closed for, it was estimated 230 days before things started to reopen in mid-June of 2021. So 230 days total from the beginning of the pandemic. So let's say call that late March of 2020. So a long period of shutdown, which forced retailers to develop the e-commerce channel so that they could sell online and protect their businesses. But also consumers were shopping for essential goods during that time as well. So that was the real driving force of this astounding growth of 75%. And it's curious that you mentioned Argentina as well. Their largest city, Buenos Aires, had similar restrictions on retail. So the two largest growth markets for retail e-commerce in our forecast were directly related to the length of the retail lockdowns in each of those countries.
Was there a disproportionate impact on bigger retailers or smaller retailers?
Yeah, it's quite a topic of conversation, because big box stores like Walmart and Costco remained open throughout the pandemic, and that was because they sold groceries and other essential items. It really had a disproportionate impact on smaller and independent retail. The Canadian Federation of Independent Business represents small retail pretty well as a lobby group in this country. And they surveyed their survey base, or their member base, in March of 2021. And about a third of their members said they had revenue that was comparable to pre-pandemic. So more than 2/3 had significant revenue declines. So that sector of retail got hit really, really hard. And other sectors of retail, like grocery, has done extremely well.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the same trends happening in the UK. One of those categories that struggled was clothing and footwear. And it's interesting you talk about these big box retailers and the smaller independent retailers. So just a UK flavor to this, in the fashion category, a lot of the big traditional established retailers really struggled during the pandemic. So some notable casualties were Debenhams in the UK and the Arcadia Group, which owned Topshop and Burton's, among other stores. What actually happened was these, I use the word smaller in inverted commas, but smaller digital first fashion retailers have actually ended up buying these bankrupt traditional retailers. So these smaller retailers have actually pivoted to digital and benefited really, really well. So I'm interested as to why there's been a disproportionate negative impact on these independent retailers in Canada. Is anything like that happened in Canada?
I don't have anything off the top of my head that is comparable to that, but I think when it comes to things like apparel and clothing, I think, people they weren't going to work as much as they would normally. They weren't being as social as they would normally. So discretionary purchases like clothing and footwear, that sort of thing, could have seen a dampening in 2020, especially with economic uncertainty as well. So I think that is a factor that that particular retail sector was dealing with last year.
What does 2021 look like? I mean, we saw that huge growth in 2020.
Yeah, continued growth. Yep. So, 12.5% growth in 2021 on retail e-commerce. That will bring it to, sort of in the 11% range of total retail overall. So we've been noticing over the course of the last decade that we've been tracking this, a gradual climb in Canada e-commerce. Now, Canada was, especially compared to the US, slower to adopt retail e-commerce for a variety of reasons in years past. Things like the nature of the population, how spread out it was, how costly it was to fulfill orders via e-commerce to this spread out population, relatively small population as well. So things took slower or more time to develop in Canada for e-commerce, but I think the pandemic really just kind of accelerated things by 5 years or more.
Great. I think that gives us a good primer for the region as a whole. Let's move on to your next story. You want to tell me about cross-border commerce in Canada. Why is this a story?
Yeah, it's a story because more than half of the digital buyers that we track in Canada make cross-border purchases. So the proximity to a massive retail environment like the US provides a lot of choice for Canadian consumers. So more than half of those digital buyers that we forecast in the country are also cross-border shoppers as well. It's really just a factor of the great choice that they have south of the border and the relative lack of choice that was previously available to them from domestic retail.
Is that where most of the cross-border trading occurs, just across that border?
It's the number one market. So we saw some research from Flow Commerce last year that showed about 70% of the buyers surveyed by Flow were buying from the US compared to significantly less from China and the UK, down sort of less than 1/3. So the US is by far the number one cross-border shopping destination for consumers in Canada.
Okay, and this topic really interests me. As you might imagine, in the UK, we were part of this incredible trading bloc where there was frictionless cross-border trading with the EU. We have now extricated ourselves from that, and there are all sorts of terrible stories of retailers on the continent not shipping to the UK anymore because of the friction now involved and costs as well. Mm-hmm. Are there any such problems across the borders in Canada?
There are. So one of the things that, we talked about, more than half of digital buyers being cross-border shoppers, that number would be significantly higher, I think, if it weren't for the prospect of custom and duties being applied to a lot of these purchases. And also the protectionist retail policy in Canada that sort of props up domestic retail versus foreign competition. So there's a de minimis levy that basically means that goods from Mexico and the US are duty-free under a certain threshold, but that threshold is very, very low comparatively. So it serves as a sort of a dampening effect for cross-border commerce.
Fantastic. Okay, and so your last story, Paul, is about that perennial e-commerce champion of Canada, Shopify. I know you've spoken about this on podcasts many times before, but how has Shopify solidified its position through the pandemic?
Sure. So obviously 2020 was a massive year for the company. It rode the wave of the 2020 e-commerce boom. What's really interesting this year is their strategic partnerships that they're making, especially with social media players. So back earlier in the year, they partnered with Facebook to make their Shop Pay facility available on Facebook shops and Instagram shops in the US for US merchants. So they also have a marketing partnership with TikTok. So they're making a lot of waves in the social commerce arena. And it's really the biggest barrier to social commerce's explosion, I think, is that payment facility within the social media apps themselves. And Shop Pay is providing an ability to do that. So I think they might have a accelerant effect on social commerce in the US, certainly, and then in Canada in the future.
Yeah, we had some social buyer numbers, right? Do you know what those numbers are like for Canada?
Yeah, so social buyers are 7.9 social buyers in Canada, which is about a quarter of the population aged 14 and older. So that channel for purchasing goods as part of the buyer journey is developed quite significantly, and we're going to see that continue in the future, especially as these checkout facilities are made available.
Yeah, I know, again, this is just from the top of my head, but I was looking through these social buyer numbers and there's been some significant movement, I think, in our forecasts in a number of countries this year.
Yeah. And right now we do consider social commerce to be, so if you're in Facebook shop or Instagram shop and you link to a retailer site and make the purchase there, we consider that part of social buying as well. So when the payment facilities become part of that, we're going to see an acceleration of those numbers, I'm pretty sure.
That's a great point. Thanks for adding that. It's not just about social with Shopify, though, is it? I mean, we spoke about independent retailers earlier, and Shopify is really important for that class of retailer, right?
Right. It's quite interesting how they message to the market and to the street, how they are sort of enabling small independent retailers to choose an alternative to Amazon. So instead of, defaulting to the Amazon marketplace as a way to market, you can become a lot of D2C brands and smaller retailers are setting up their own shop, if you will, online using Shopify. And so in their quarterly earnings calls, they're very, very strong in their message that they are empowering these smaller retailers to really compete against big giants of retail.
Yeah, and they really are a global company now. And my sort of yardstick as to whether a company has really arrived, my parents know who Shopify is. They said to me the other week, they said, we bought this thing and it said something about Shopify. I said, it's arrived.
There you go. That's a good litmus test.
Yeah. Well, Paul, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. Some really interesting stories there. Thank you very much for joining me, and we will speak again soon, I'm sure. We are now going to take a quick break to hear from our sponsor, and then I'll be back with Chung to talk about China and e-commerce.
Retail's next competitive threat may come from a business model or channel that didn't even exist a few months ago. This modern dynamic requires companies to adapt quickly, pivoting business seemingly overnight, something traditional commerce platforms just can't support. There's a new enterprise commerce platform on the rise, one that's fast, flexible, and doesn't require 9 months and $1 million to get up and running. Go to vtex.com/eMarketer to learn more.
Welcome back, and also welcome to our research analyst for China and Japan, Chung. Hi, Chung.
Hey guys, thanks for having me here.
Great to have you on board. Okay, we can't really have a retail e-commerce podcast without talking about China. I mentioned at the top of the show about China's dominance in this space, China accounting for over 50% of global retail e-commerce sales, and there are heaps of things we could talk about in China from an e-commerce perspective, but we've covered a lot of them in depth already on some of our previous podcasts. So, Chung, you've picked a couple of really interesting alternative stories, if I can call them that, for us today. And I want to start with the rise of some interesting D2C tactics that you've seen smaller players adopting in China in order to compete with and even outmaneuver some of the bigger players. Why don't you talk to me about that?
Yeah, so these so-called D2C brand from China is really sort of changing the landscape for Chinese brands. They represent a new generation of brands that grew up in the internet era. So they tend to be really data savvy. They are really speedy in being able to adapt to these newer trends and incorporate them, whether it's in their product design or in their marketing campaign. And they're just really interesting to talk about. So here we are.
So can you give us a couple of examples?
Yeah, so a few trends that have emerged in recent years include pet ownership in China, which is all the rage. Similar to everywhere else, we got hit by the pandemic and pet ownership has grown, exponentially. On top of that, young people in China also getting married later in their lives. So a lot of times these pets, primarily dogs and cats, are acting as their companion. And so we have these brands that sort of take advantage of this trend and introduce these elements of animals on the packaging. One of them is Perfect Diary, is a rising Chinese domestic beauty brand they have launched a campaign based on this animal theme in the packaging, in their cases of the makeup, along with Discovery brand. And that sold like really well online. And also one of the most famous influencer in China, Li Jiaqi, he has launched his own brand as well. And he actually uses his own pet dog as the brand ambassadors.
Okay, so that's really interesting. I thought you were going to tell me about like pet related brands, but you're talking about just any brand. They're just jumping on board this pet ownership trend, right?
Yeah, exactly. Just, putting images of pets like on the packaging, I think is really appealing. It's really cute. Young people really like it. And, to add to that, I think a lot of these trends are actually millennial/Gen Z driven, right? So another one that I want to cover is actually the rise, or I should say the renaissance of traditional Chinese culture, and how brands are using these traditional aesthetics, ingredients, scenic spots, and sort of like elements in the clothing to adopt them into their product designs. Like, for example, one of the brand is Florasis. So again, this is a beauty brand. They have incorporated elements of traditional culture and imprint them onto the palette, the makeup palette. And it is selling really well. I think when young people see that, they sort of have a sense of pride in their own culture, and they're just like rediscovering that. I think for older Chinese generations, they tend to, during the early days of the economic boom, they tend to look to the West for inspiration, whereas younger people, they tend to see Chinese domestic brands and foreign brands as equals in almost all categories, maybe with the exception of auto. So another brand that I would like to talk about is called Chi Cream. So this is an ice cream bar brand. And what they do is they incorporated traditional rooftop tile design to their ice cream bars. And again, they also push really high quality and very unique traditional ingredients in their products. So yeah, that's just some example of brands that have tapped into this, boom of traditional Chinese culture into their products.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It sounds like that a lot of these brands are aimed at younger groups. That's what you're saying, right? Younger
yes, I
groups.
think we can sort of generalize.
Yeah.
Those
okay.
ideas. Yeah.
So if I want to be a successful brand in China, I've just got to bang a pet on the packaging and make it look traditional, and then I want a winner.
Yeah, I think it's sort of like tricky, right, as a foreign brand, because there is that sort of accusation that you are, that's cultural appropriation.
Yeah.
Right? You're not from here, so why are you just like taking elements of our culture and just slapping it onto your product, right? A lot of times that doesn't work. For example, a fashion brand, take like a handbag, for example, they would just like put a Chinese character on their bag, and a lot of times that just doesn't fly for Chinese consumers.
Right.
So brands have to be really careful with that.
Yeah, makes sense. Talk to me about one other topic that you mentioned in the prep call for this recording. Blind boxes. Tell me what these are, please.
Yeah, so blind boxes is not unsimilar to when you purchase a baseball card or a stack of Pokemon cards. You don't know what's in there. So every time you purchase a pack of cards, it's a surprise. And that's when some of the brands came in and borrowed that concept into their marketing campaigns, right? So young people, again, a lot of times these are driven by young people. They just sort of feel like this satisfaction when they open up these boxes, and that makes them want to go back and get this, perhaps the second box or third box. Not to mention that there's also a lot of times a secondary trade market, right? So some of the product categories and brands that have adopted this strategy includes travel, office supplies, snacks, pet apparel, and baby clothes.
Okay, I think I get it, but you're not talking like the cost of a baseball card pack. You're talking about items that can be substantially more expensive than that, right?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, some of these product categories, they tend to be kind of items that won't run the risk of upsetting the consumer if they open the box and found out that it's not exactly what they're hoping for. We talk about snacks, right? Office supplies, baby clothes. Those are fine, right? One category that surprised me is actually travel. And it's amazing how they pulled it off. I think that it was because during the pandemic, no one was traveling and they were willing to just give away travel packages for a really low price. So yeah, that sort of enticed people to, it's not much of a risk if they just have to pay a couple hundreds and get a trip to a really nice place, right?
You know what? That doesn't sound too crazy to me. So a quick story. As a 19, 20-year-old, I went on my first holiday abroad with a partner and did exactly that. I gave the travel agency, because it was a long time ago, I went into a travel agency, gave them a couple of £100 and didn't know where I was going to go. But I was delighted when I turned up at the airport. They flew us to Greece and we had a great time. It was cheap and it was a nice surprise. So that doesn't surprise me at all, actually, that they've managed to pull that off. One thing I just want to ask you about. So I understand this baseball card thing, and a very personal analogy now. I have 2 kids. They play online games and they are very much into FIFA, soccer, and they buy player packs online, and it's very easy to buy them online. And then they open the packs, they get to keep the players and put them in their team. And very often they don't get the players they want, so they come and tap me for more money so they can buy the next pack and the next pack. And EA, who own the FIFA franchise, have had to alter the way they do this because they are marketing to children. They're selling these products to children. They have had to provide like preview pack, I think, where you can actually see potentially the players that you're going to get. Otherwise, this would fall into gambling category because you're paying money for something that you don't know what you're going to get, and it's addictive and the kids want to buy more. And because it's at children, they were essentially going to be regulated. Is there any kind of regulation of this thing for blind boxes in China?
Yeah, so I think they will eventually have to introduce some kind of regulation, right? Just cite an example. And as depressing as it sounds, actually, there was this incident where a company were doing these blind boxes of live animals, live pets, and they were just put into plastic crates. It made the news on Weibo. It was at the time one of the hottest news out there, and a lot of these animals were treated inhumanely, right? So as sad as it sounds, that's what sometimes it sort of takes for regulators to realize, the risk of some of these marketing tactics if they are not regulated. And I believe that, Chinese regulators do move fairly quickly when they do see something wrong, and perhaps, somebody's on top of this trend as well.
Yeah. And before we move on to your next story, Chung, I mean, we've introduced this as sort of a D2C kind of trend, but presumably some of the bigger box retailers are trying to muscle in on these kind of trends as well. How are the smaller online retailers coping with that kind of competition?
I haven't seen too many of these big box retailers that are getting into this trend as of now. And I think, this trend is really value for, the items that the kids get are collectibles, right? They don't care if they're buying from a big box retailer or a smaller brand. It needs to be something that they can really appreciate, I guess, so to speak. So they have to like the design. It needs to be cute. So I think it doesn't matter the size of the retailer. I think smaller brands have done it successfully. And I think, a lot of different players could be in this game, regardless of the size.
Okay, great. Now let's move on to your second story then. And this one is really fascinating. So for a country that accounts for such a large proportion of e-commerce sales, it stands to reason that it also must account for an awful lot of packaging. What does that mean for China's green credentials?
Yeah, as you mentioned, so China has the biggest e-commerce market in the world, right? And it's still growing fast. It's growing 18.5% year on year. This year, So it's huge, right? And of course, it's going to produce a lot of waste in terms of shipping packages and carbon emission from deliveries, right? Just last year, single day alone, we are looking at Alibaba, and they produce 2.32 billion packages just on that shopping holiday. And according to Greenpeace, online shopping created 9.4 million tons of packaging in China in 2018, which will skyrocket to 41 million tons by 2025. And if you don't know, now you know. So Chinese government has pledged to be carbon neutral by 2060. So with the explosion of online commerce, it just runs counter to the goal of becoming carbon neutral. So I suspect that in the coming years, perhaps there will be more and more regulation being introduced to sort of rein in the waste created by this online shopping craze that is happening right now. And I think some of the players are already doing a lot of things, a few things, I should say, not a lot. But Alibaba has introduced this 100% biodegradable packaging options. Last Singles Day, they have also introduced tape-free packaging for some of the paper packaging. They are trying to use smaller boxes or minimize the size of the boxes that they use and switching to e-receipts instead of paper receipts. Of course, all these runs at a cost. I think they're charging brands about double the price for these packaging that are more environmentally friendly, but in return, they're also willing to compensate by providing extra promotion on their site. Looking at second biggest player, JD.com, they have pledged to cut their carbon emission by 5% this past shopping holiday in June, deploying more electric vehicles and also optimizing their logistics network. And lastly, I want to mention Suning.com. They have introduced this reusable plastic box program for their deliveries, and they're starting in 13 cities and planning to expand that program as well.
Yeah, interesting to hear about the packaging, the recyclable packaging, the biodegradable packaging. Again, I've got my UK coloured spectacles on, but there was a news article this week that there is a cardboard shortage in the UK. Again, a huge e-commerce boom. Everybody's getting all these deliveries, and the cardboard boxes are sitting at home. People are storing things in them. I've got 2 or 3 in my office here. What is China doing? If we just go beyond e-commerce here, what sort of things is China doing to encourage things like recycling?
Yeah, so there's so much left to be done. I mean, speaking of these packaging boxes, even though Alibaba introduced 100% biodegradable options, they still create a lot of waste. During the production process of these boxes, a lot of water is needed, right? So we definitely need to have some sort of comprehensive regulation for China to, even achieve its goal in 2060 to become carbon neutral, right? So the government has actually banned free plastic bags and roll out a pilot recycling programs at major cities. And it has also stopped the use of single-use plastic straws. But I think you can still find plastic bag being used, being offered by retailers. So I think it comes down to, not just the government, not just the companies, the online retailers, but also the consumers as well in order to meet the target.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I want to talk about sustainable shopping or secondhand commerce or re-commerce, whatever you want to call it. We actually recorded last month's Around the World episode about this, but we didn't have you on the show. I guess it was a kind of ignorance on my part because I wasn't really aware that there was much of a market for sustainability in China. Go ahead and tell me why I was wrong about that.
Yeah, so, I think a lot of people have that misconception, right? If you look back just in the last 10 years, where China came from, it came from, being the factory of the world and so much pollution going on. So in a sense, they understand the damage that a polluted environment can do to their lifestyle, right? And so awareness is actually pretty high, right? What consumer expect from companies in terms of their sustainability practices is quite high. it definitely, I would say, do not lag behind their Western European counterparts, right? And one of the really interesting survey that I have come across was done by Wanderman Thompson. So they asked consumer if they are willing to contribute 0.5% of the annual salary to solve climate change issues. And respondents from China as well as the UK and the US took part in this survey. And actually, Chinese respondents came out on top in terms of the proportion of respondents who answer, yes, I'm willing to pay up in order to protect the environment. So that just tells brand that, Chinese consumers are willing to pay up if you introduce products that are more environmentally friendly. And another question that was being asked was, what was the biggest barrier to living sustainably? And the top two challenges were actually, it took too much effort, or it's not convenient enough, and being too expensive was only ranked third. So again, it implies that perhaps, they're willing to pay just a little bit more for products that are greener.
Yeah. What about, when you're talking about expense, what about this secondhand product, e-commerce? What's that market looking like in China now?
I think, in the West, we sort of take that for granted. We grew up with garage sales, thrift shops, and, of course, we have Facebook marketplaces as well. But in China, it's a burgeoning market. So there are now 182 million people shopping on these secondhand goods, e-commerce marketplaces. The secondhand product retail e-commerce sales in China in 2020 grew 44.2% to renminbi 374.5 billion.
Wow.
So I think there's this coolness to this sort of, not just, we're not just talking about online, but offline as well. I think there's this coolness to it, right? This used good secondhand sort of vintage product that young people are starting to discover. And I think there's still a lot of stigma to it. Like, they might think of it as being dirty, as inviting bad luck, right? But there's also a growing acceptance, I think, as society gets wealthier. It's sort of like a counterculture against rampant consumerism that is going on in the country as well.
Okay, and did you mention that it may be younger consumers that are driving this trend as well?
Yeah, I would say, people who were born in the 90s or Gen Z are mostly the ones supporting this growing trend right now. And they're also learning from these influencers on social platform as well.
Okay, brilliant. Chung, thank you very much. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today on Behind the Numbers Around the World, brought to you by VTEX. Thanks again to my guests, Paul and Chung, and thanks to all of you for listening. Do remember us when you go on your big shop this week. If you want to ask us any questions, you can, of course, email us at podcast@eMarketer.com. And I believe Marcus will be back with you tomorrow with the Behind the Numbers Daily. He hopes to see you there. Bye-bye.